what's happening with the data, how are you using the data, how are you ensuring that this is actually developmentally appropriate for your population, what are you going to do with the data once you collect it. Like, all of these things are critical in my opinion, right? Because we are going to just perpetuate cycles of poverty for people who will never have an opportunity to get out of, the rut they're in, because the system continues to only reward people that can afford the very best.
I'd like to welcome Jeanine DeFalco, Dr. Jeanine DeFalco. I wanted to begin with, could you introduce yourself? Because you wear lots of different hats and do lots of different things. And it'd be good just to let people know a little bit about your background and what you do and all those kind of things.
Sure. So I'm Dr. Jeanine DeFalco. By trade, I'm a cognitive psychologist. I really kind of consider myself a learning scientist. That I've been focused in the intelligent technologies, adaptive instructional system space for probably about 13 years. More recently, what I'm really focusing on is how are we designing emerging technologies to support complex decision making, like workforce readiness, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's really what I've discovered about the simulation and training space is it's a very interdisciplinary space in order to design systems, to deploy them effectively. And I do have an interdisciplinary background, so it fits.
Great,
amazing.
So you're moving around kind of lots of different spaces and places, and it seems like AI has been quite a big thing at the moment. And you mentioned adaptive systems. Can you talk a little bit about that and what they are?
Sure. So in the really computer-based systems, right? So if we kind of look back when computers really started emerging, the personal computer, I remember when they were coming out, I'm that old. TRS-80s, the old stuff. But when we started really getting into kind of computer-based instruction, a lot of that, what started to happen is really we would look at in terms of intelligent tutoring systems. That's really kind of what we went into. We had computer-based, so maybe it would tell you some information. The intelligent tutoring system is more, you would take an input from a learner, it would kind of track if you got the answer correct, incorrect. It would give some kind of remediation, and you go back. But historically, intelligent tutoring systems require a lot of hand scripting, right? A lot of branching in order to say, if you do this, then that. And what I saw was, when I got involved, is most of that work was math-based, right? So, which is kind of easy. You either get the answer right or wrong. As we have had newer technologies, we've kind of moved from intelligent tutoring, which has that kind of binary yes or no, into more of this adaptive instructional space, which to me has been broad in the sense of we use more game-based, maybe we use more simulations, augmented reality, virtual reality, and how are we integrating these different kinds of technologies? Again, not just to support knowledge acquisition, right? But at least my push has been, yeah, that's great, we know stuff. It's great we know stuff, but what we really want to know is how do we apply that knowledge in context, right? Because that's what we want to know. It's not enough to say I can get a 1 out of 4 chance of getting something correct on a multiple choice exam. I want to be able to kind of pressure test that in context. So the context then becomes the augmented, immersive, simulation, game-based training, where you have lots of different kinds of choices you could make, because it's not often, what I've learned in life is it's not just that there's a right answer. In fact, I had a theater director tell me that once. I was like, what's the right choice? And she goes, it's not about a right choice. It's like, you have lots of choices you can make. What is the better choice, right? So it's a different way of evaluating it. And I look at this moving out, not that we want to leave STEM, but really moving more into what we kind of consider the squishy stuff. The ethical decision-making, problem-solving, leadership, teamwork, problem-solving, what I would think of as transferable skills in the space, especially in a landscape, I think, that's shifting. Like, why are kids going to school? When they get to get out? What is the point? So it's more of looking a competency kind of development, using adaptive instructional systems for competency development and measurement, as opposed to just demonstrating knowledge acquisition. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of how these kind of new adaptive learning technologies might start to be seen in the educational space, do you foresee that we're going to, I mean, they're already being used a little bit in school education here. Mm. Are you seeing that is going to be sort of like a rapidly expanding space? And what kind of time frame are we looking at before in schools, for example, I don't know, maybe even in primary school, you've got an adaptive learning system monitoring your reading, and the teachers are also using them to develop decision-making skills. I don't know.
Yeah. I see a proliferation in using AI, right, in terms of creating kind of it's a surface level adaptive instructional system where it becomes dynamic to what the input is of the learner. So I see a lot of AI wrappers. And it's fine, right? Like, there's a place for it. I'm a gamer. I think I played like 650 hours on Hogwarts Legacy and God of War, right? So like it's, games are fine. The problem in the education and training space, and especially when we think about first, vulnerable populations, children, high risk, high compliance. That to me is a different kind of rigor, right? Because it's not enough to have an AI wrapper saying like, oh, you did a great job, even if you didn't, right? That doesn't help anybody. I want my surgeon to be able to do the job, not just be like a participation trophy. So there's two issues in that. One is I have seen a lack of expertise in the education and training space when we're making decisions about how to design these systems, right? And it really actually goes a step further back. So my father was a professor of education. He actually he was a seminarian, and when he came out, he had a degree in philosophy. And they're like, well, Tony, what can you do? He's like, I can philosophize. And then he went into education, right? So he really studied this philosophy of education, and part of that was very John Dewey. What is the purpose of education, right? Like, to what end am I putting my kids in school that I'm getting these degrees? So when we think about the classroom, part of the problem is there has to be a decision about what is valuable to teach, right? So it's not just the knowledge, but it's also to what end are we applying that knowledge? This is where I think there's hesitation, right?
Yeah, it gets really close to a number of the things we've been talking about recently with people, which is we kind of feel like the underpinnings of education is shifting right as we speak.
Yeah.
And you can see it happening really quickly, both because of the way that AI is possibly changing education and how people are engaging with education and assessment, but also on the back end, what do people do when they graduate? Because it looks like the jobs are shifting. And that's really raising these big questions about why have we got education? Yes. How do we do education? What's it for? What's the purpose? These big questions are starting to emerge.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is what's old is new again, right? So John Dewey was an American philosopher, and really kind of led that whole progressivist constructive education, like at the turn of the 19th, into the 20th century. And at that time, educators are at fisticuffs about what is the point of education. And on the one hand, you said, hey, we're supposed to train, people to get jobs. Because it was really the Industrial Revolution. Like, let's teach them to go into a factory. Let's teach them to do these things. And Dewey was like, yeah, however, right? How about we teach them how to think? How about we teach them, again, some of these other kind of transferable skills? My father's going to have a heart attack when he hears me talk about Dewey, because he's a Dewey scholar, and I always get it, I kind of got it. But what I know enough is that there was this divide in that space to say we have an industrial revolution, we need workers for this industry, and Dewey was looking at it to say, but we're also in a democracy. And what does that mean? And in a democracy, the only way it works is if you have informed individuals that can think and reason and have kind of this discriminate intelligence. Like what's not necessarily right and wrong, but what's good, what's better, what's best. So we're going through that again, right? A lot of people have talked about kind of like this fourth industrial revolution. So it's the same concerns are there. I don't know that it's much different. When I was going back to school, it was, should I be a coder? right? Should I become an engineer? Should I, learn how to, and my feeling was like, it's a waste of my time, because at some point systems will be able to tell other systems how to create systems. What I was more interested in is in how do we design them ethically? How do we design them insightfully? And what is the human element in this? And what are those, again, skills and competencies that can stand the test of time when a job then is it's either that job no longer exists because we've outsourced it to robotics or automation. But the other issue is that how do we develop people that can have intelligent, human-centric teaming with automation and AI, right? And this is a lot of things I tell my students. I'm generally pretty flexible when I grade their work. I don't make them write papers anymore. I make them do research. I make them evaluate it. But I say, if I see a single hallucination in your references, it is an automatic 0 without any discussion. Because if you are promoting misconceptions, that's your job, is to make sure it's not a misconception. And if we're not teaching them the critique, right, of the output, then we're going to continue to perpetuate not just misconceptions but harm. That's my opinion. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of the difficulties is the kind of the institutional context and frameworks within which those kind of cultures are developing and those priorities are developing. So, for example, in the UK university system that I'm most familiar with, you would think you could have those conversations about what a human-centric education system would look like, but it's not as simple as that, right? You can't just have a kind of a value-based or philosophical discussion about that, because the universities have become businesses. So their strategy is very much led by, hey, there's this new technology and we don't want to scare our students off using it, so we'll incorporate it everywhere, and we'll ask the questions about whether that's ethical, whether that's valuable later on down the line. So my university has just incorporated a whole new load of AI tools, and they're speaking about that. Oh, this is a new great thing. Like, now you have this as standard. Okay, it might be a great thing, but there's no evaluation of that going on in terms of value, ethics, and what kind of education system are we building. So I think one of the things I'm most interested in is where can that conversation happen? What are the spaces for that conversation to happen? And who's genuinely interested in asking those questions away from just kind of business drivers, yeah? We've got to make our university in the top 100 universities, otherwise we're going to collapse economically. So, Adam, don't ask all these awkward questions.
I'm all about the awkward questions. Well, I will say, so one of the other hats that I wear is I'm vice chair for AI standards for IEEE. And within IEEE, there's different verticals. And one of the other verticals, I don't have a leadership position in this. So it's AI Standards Committee, right? So we've got like over 60, 70 working groups. But there's also the Learning Technology Standards under IEEE. And under that vertical, I was chair of 2247.4. And that 2247 was for adaptive instructional systems. So my mentor, Dr. Bob Sotomayor, is kind of the godfather of the Generalized Intelligent Framework for Tutoring. Brilliant man, brilliant engineer. He funded my doctoral work because he was the chief engineer in the simulation training lab for the U.S. Army. Anyway, he in this effort of establishing standards for adaptive instructional systems, one of the subgroups we created was the recommended practice for the ethical design and development of adaptive instructional systems. Because again, looking at adaptive instructional systems, AISs, we recognized it was going to mostly influence vulnerable populations, right? Or populations that had very little personal autonomy. So whether that was the military or that was students. So we worked like 5 years on that. And it was so interesting when I would have conversations with some other engineers. They're like, well, you can't tell us what's valuable. You can't, assert a value principle. I'm like, sure we can. Of course, yes, that's the whole point, right? The whole point, at least for AISs, I'm like, look, there's certain things we can collectively agree on. I will just say that my third child is currently finishing her master's in philosophy at Cambridge, and so I actually reference her a lot. She's going to be starting her PhD in philosophy, and I've often asked her to say, like, help me understand the logical framework when I'm faced with people who say you can't assert this principle. And what we, she gave me a little bit of guidance, but the idea is to say, like, we can scope to say, in this space, this is what we collectively think is important. And from that, then, we are going to devise ethical principles as a community to say, this is what's important. I'm not saying for the whole world. I'm just saying for adaptive instructional systems. So what we spent 5 years on this standard, and it was just adopted as a global standard. Now, in the sense that what we did was to say, it's not a thou shalt not. So I'm Roman Catholic by tradition, right? And I know a lot about Roman Catholicism, and it's like, thou shalt not do this thing. And any good Catholic will be like, great, but if I do it this other way, I could kind of get away with it. So I said, this is not what we don't want to do that. What we want to be able to do is to say, here are the principles we think are important, starting with human flourishing, right? And then working our way down. So like transparency, explainability, sustainability, those kinds of things. But what we wanted to say is, how can an organization then, once we understand how we're defining it, how can they then pressure test if they're in compliance? And how do they both represent that internally? What's the documentation for that? And then what is the external representation to a community? And so how is that going to inform their design and deployment decisions? What I recognize is that even though we define the principles and we have a way of kind of doing an audit trail, what we didn't provide were actually the prompts, were the questions for people to ask themselves. Because again, I could say, hey, human flourishing, but then what does that mean? Right. And then how do you apply the principle in context? So in that chapter, what we're doing is we're like, these are the kinds of questions as an organization you should be asking yourself as you are designing these systems. And I think it's going to be a better roadmap, because with technology, again, the minute you say you can't do it this way, someone's going to do a workaround. And I do really believe, a lot of people have said, well, aren't you worried your daughter's never going to get a job in philosophy? I'm like, I think that everybody needs to take philosophy. I think everybody should learn how to think, right? And apply it, because when in my world, having worked in the military, ethics actually is not an option. The minute you engage in unethical behavior, people get hurt. And it is interesting to me when people think it's optional. It's like, it's optional when you think it's never going to affect you until it does, right? And so that is the problem with a university who doesn't do that intellectual, due diligence to say because when we look at the proliferations of all kinds of technologies, the nuclear bomb, mustard gas, all these kinds of things, when we don't think, and yet what is the thing that can happen when we implement this new technology and then people get hurt, that to me is not a great risk management approach. Then you're in a defensive posture because you've now caused harm because you haven't thought through the analysis. Okay, now I'm done. I'm done pontificating. Thank you.
Can I get into, earlier on you were talking about adaptive systems, and you said the early adaptive systems, very often mathematical. I guess somebody got a question wrong, they'd repeat the question and that type of question until they could get it right. And I guess basic adaptive systems now probably are doing similar things, or do they work differently? What type of data is being collected? Is it literally just about right and wrong, or is wider data being collected? Because I'm aware these systems could collect all sorts of data now about people. And if we think about the kind of companies getting involved, quite often they do social media. And we're aware that those kind of companies have very interesting algorithms that know all sorts of things about you, not necessarily just whether you can get something right or wrong. So I wonder where that data is going and what type of data it is.
I'm so glad you asked that question. So it depends on the system, right? That is part of the issue. For intelligent tutoring systems or adaptive instructional systems, computer-based systems, we're still getting, there's the basic metrics like you completed this course and how long did you spend on this course and did you get your exam correct? And like we have those basic kind of measurements. When we start to integrate immersive and augmented reality into those, where now it's more procedural, right? We still have the click and point, like what is the correct answer? And then we have completions, like did I pick up the right hammer? Did I put the needle where it was supposed to be? So and I can't help myself. But so in 2024, I started a company in 2023 in my she cave, not because I think it would do anything, but just because I was like, I think I can do it better. And then I applied for a National Science Foundation grant, and I got it in December 2024 because I knew, again, enough, knowing intelligent tutoring systems and AISs and in simulations, generally speaking, there's a couple things that happen. They build a simulation that's super fidelitous. They're like, look at this rendering of the Earth. It's like, okay, great. And what, right? And then what? And again, it was the same metrics. You go in, you complete it. So we call it sets and reps. And this is heavy in the DoD, especially the Air Force. They use a lot of simulation training. Medical, same thing, right? They go in, they practice, but they're not capturing the behavioral data. And the reason they're not catching the behavioral data is because they're not designing it for behavioral data. So the platform that we built, we called it Genesis, right? The platform we built was to both leverage what we knew about learning engineering, right? So how are we designing a system for data? If I have you go through a system where you have to make different choices, and I can capture things like, did you ask for help? Were you hesitant? Did you try multiple times? Where were you looking? Where were you not looking? What were you paying attention to? And so the reason we can capture that contextual data is by integrating the XAPI, right? The XAPI telemetry. Then you can say, when the learner is going through these steps, we can capture all this other kinds of data, which will do two things. One is then we can establish what we kind of consider like a proficiency model. So someone who's an expert would make these kinds of choices. But we can also then, because the system is designed for data and it collects data, then we can export that data and feed that back into the system and saying, when we've run 100, 200, 300, 1,000 people through the system, now we can get a better sense of where the misconceptions. Is it a design issue or is it actually a fundamental misconception? And then continue to iterate to develop that expert model. We consider this a fourth generation of an AI-driven adaptive instructional system. That's what we've built. Nobody actually knows what the hell I'm talking about half the time as I talk about it, because in the marketplace right now, again, when we're talking about like ours right now is conversational simulations, and there are other companies that are doing conversational simulations. There's one, I won't mention their name, but I went and I tested it. And it said, so you're applying for this job, and what makes you think that you are ready for this job? But I'm like, what makes you think you're good enough to evaluate me? And so like the whole time I'm trying to cause problems with the agent to be disruptive, to be antagonistic. And by the end, it was like, you did great. I'm like, no, I didn't. I did a terrible job. But the idea was that system is like, we're judgment free. I'm like, judgment free does not help anybody. Judgment free, like go play a game, go play again, World of Warcraft or something. So that is the other problem. When I talked about an interdisciplinary approach to these systems, is that it's not enough to understand the constraints and affordances of the technology. You have to also understand, like, okay, what is the value of what you're teaching, and then how do you design it in a way to get the data?
I see a lot of this. So I've been to a few different shows, and I'm part of an AI group in Hong Kong, and people who are designing education things, it's surprising how few of them actually have an education background. And so they know the tech, but if you start talking about teaching and learning, they're basically just going, well, yeah, I went to school and university, so I know about it. Which is one of the problems with education. Everybody's an expert because everybody went through the system.
Yes.
But I mean, I started doing some work in designing some things around AI, and I suddenly started realizing I could start collecting some really interesting data on students. So again, AI to start giving feedback, and then how's the student responding? Does the student respond better to something that's humorous, or is it more kind of stick carrot type thing? And I can start getting to a point where I'm psychologically profiling the student. I can start to categorize the student and think of the student in lots of different ways, which are not just academic. And that data can be really powerful from a psychological perspective. I start thinking about what I do as a teacher, and I can start to think about designing a system that works in similar ways to me as a teacher.
Right.
The thing is, as a teacher, I see a student and then they leave, and 3 or 4 years later, broadly, I've forgotten all about fine-grained detail. But if I'm designing a system with an AI, that data can stay on a system for a long time. And there's a word, interoperability, which has entered my lexicon recently.
Yes.
And I know there's a lot of talk about this.
Right.
And how this data can be used in lots of different ways. So I create AI system A for primary kids, and then the middle school system actually would like to link to my data because that makes sense. We don't want to lose that data on that kid. So all of a sudden my system plugs in, but that means that the data from when that kid was 5 is now floating into them being 11.
Yeah.
And all of these things. So I'm just interested in this, and it's not just learning data, because I think it would be wrong to think that in the next few years we're just talking about learning data here. We're going to be talking about how long it takes a student to answer a question. Did they find that hard? When they found it hard, how did they respond? What's their level of resilience, etc., etc.
Yeah, the problem I have with that, right? Like, I guess obviously it depends on how you are storing and identifying the data, right? So I had 4 kids. My youngest is an undergrad at University of Tampa. And this is what I know about my raising 4 children. Everyone's different, right? And so one, I can bribe. The other one, I can threaten with corporal punishment. The other one, I can pay off, right? They same parents, same household, and they're all responding to different things, and they all develop in different ways at different times with different contexts. And the problem with learning is it's so much. It's, you know, when I teach childhood development and adolescent development, and the question is it nature, is it nurture? And I'm like, it's both is the problem, right? Both what's happening in the environment and both kind of what are some of the, you know, how they're originally wired. So when you're getting data on a 5-year-old and keeping that over a period of time, if we're not contextualizing this, right? What was that data collected on, right? When I'm designing a system, I have to tell the system the data I think is important to get from that student based on the context. Now, that doesn't mean I'm getting all of the data. And we also, then there's also this other kind of expectancy bias, like in the performance anxiety, all these other things that go into that data. So, and students, no one stands put developmentally in a point of time, but how cognitively they develop is so much more than just their interaction with the system, right? Like, that is the other complication. Is it could be maybe they had something traumatic, maybe they had something wonderful, maybe, you know, there's all these other factors that go into it. So I believe deeply that education and training should never take the human out of the loop, right? The question is, what is technology good for? Right. And what I don't want, and this is the other reason why we did 2247.4 for the ethical design, is because what we didn't want these systems to be for were gatekeepers, right? So a child goes through a system and it says, you're never going to be a good nurse. And then that system's like, and then the child's like, oh, I'll never be a good nurse. Well, how does the system know, right? Maybe they would be, right? We don't want it to be a gatekeeper. And we don't want it to try and make these predictions that are limiting for students, that, you know, because you get access to different kinds of materials and you develop different skills as you grow up. And so what we didn't want these systems to be an assessment that would limit human potential. More to say, how are we using it so that we're supporting human potential? And the problem with universities, the problem with institutions, is they're like, oh, I have the data on the student. They're never going to be good at this thing because the data tells me so. Maybe, maybe not. And that's where the ethics on how people use these systems becomes so important, in my opinion.
It's going to become increasingly important that there's robust frameworks, right, for evaluating what is ethical, because there's such an opportunity for data harvesting here. And yeah, the data may not even be very accurate. About your nurse example is a good one. But we might get to a stage, I don't know, 10, 20 years time, when you get to sort of 18, 21, and there's this huge record, not only of your educational learning styles, but of other personality characteristics like resilience, or you're a bit impatient around these kind of things. I don't know about the US, but what's your kind of view of where those frameworks might come from and how they might be kind of felt within educational systems and within our kind of civic cultures?
Well, again, I think we are. I mean, the good news is you have a lot of, at least in the United States, we have a lot of teachers who hate technology, which I think is actually a good thing, right? I would be very afraid if everyone's like, yeah, let's just let the robots take over, And I think we should. I think there should be a healthy skepticism for it. I think we do need to have. I've seen and I've worked for companies that proclaim themselves to be educational testing companies or educational companies, tech companies that have zero rigor. There's zero validity. There's zero kind of reliability. I don't know what they're measuring, but it's not based on anything except just some kind of experience that somebody's having. And my colleague and we've argued. I was like, there's no such thing as agnostic data. I just don't believe in it, right? Because it's how I'm telling the system the kinds of data to collect, right? So, and this was kind of shocking to me when I was first studying statistics, because I was a theater director, and then all of a sudden I had to learn how to measure things. And so as I'm learning statistics, and they're saying, well, it's an outlier, so we just throw it away. I'm like, what do you mean you throw it away? what is that about? Like, how are we just getting rid of data? But what I've learned through my advisors and my mentors is that we do still make human judgments about data, how we collect data, how we operationalize variables. What are the things that we think are important? How are we categorizing experiences? And so I think, again, we have, I think, a moral obligation to teach people how to understand systems and data and how to implement that for decision making, and to recognize that it's always going to be limited. So I do think schools, to answer your question, schools are going to continue to find ways to integrate systems that are going to make life easier, right? I mean, the benefit of a tutoring system is if you are a teacher, and teaching's hard, right? I teach four university classes right now. And generally speaking, you teach to the mean. Your super intelligent, competent kids are like, good luck. I know you got it. My kids that are falling far behind, I'm like, find a friend, try and catch up, meet me in office hours. But I'm teaching to the middle. So in a best case scenario, an intelligent tutoring system, an AIS, leveraging these technologies can help students in a more metacognitive way, in the sense of, what do I know, what don't I know, right? When I found out when I went to Columbia and I had to take 4 stats classes, I hadn't taken math since I was 16 and I was old. And I called my father. I said, I'm never going to make it through this program. I'm going to go into curriculum and instruction. And I was doing an online intro stats class. It was every week was a different stats procedure. And first of all, nobody told me you needed a stats calculator. So I'm trying to do it on my iPhone. And then I was like, that was not working. And the TA was like, okay, where are you struggling? And I said, well, I see your answers and mine, and they're not the same. And he went, please, my dear Aunt Sally. And I was like, oh, my 5th graders learning that stuff. So I had to hire a tutor. Because I could not fundamentally grasp statistics when I had been out of math for such a long time. And I was good at math in high school, but it had been a long time. And the tutoring, we know in the tutoring space, is a more effective way of teaching, that one-on-one, right? Do you get it? Do you not get it? Let me go back, let me fix it. But to do that to scale is really, really hard. And that's where I think if we were smart about the choice, it's the right tool for the right job, right? So in classrooms or on the workforce or whatever, is to say, here's what this role requires, or here's what this domain space requires from a proficiency or competency. Where are we using technology as an assessment to say, here are the gaps and here's how we can support you so you don't fail out in your first semester or your first 6 months on a job. But using it purely as a filtering system, right? As a sorting system, which education is a sorting system, right? But using it just for that, if we're not designing them in a way that's supporting and assessing people's own understanding, like I do this well and I don't do this well and I need help in this, then what we see is that most computer-based programming has been one size fits all. the e-learning, the videos, right? And it doesn't give you any feedback, doesn't tell you how you're doing. And it does require rethinking how we're designing these systems and to what end are we building them.
Mm-hmm.
Did I answer your question? I don't know that I really answered your question, but I think there's a lot of proliferation because I think there's a lot of money to be made in the, ed tech space.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a duty to inform the decision makers and the policymakers to say, A, how do you know your system was ethically designed? What's happening with the data? How are you using the data? How are you ensuring that this is actually developmentally appropriate for your population? What are you going to do with the data once you collect it? Like all of these things are critical in my opinion, right? Because we are going to just perpetuate cycles of poverty for people who will never have an opportunity to get out of, the rut that they're in, because the system continues to only reward people that can afford the very best. And that really, to me, is not the purpose of using technology. It should be equitable, it should be democratic, and it should be supportive as opposed to, a blocker.
Yeah, it's interesting the kind of digital democracy. I wonder if we're going to end up in almost a completely different space. I can see a space coming. We were having this conversation the other day, actually, me and Adam. At the moment, there's a sense of the digital divide has been about people who can afford to give their kids iPads and access to computers and fast Wi-Fi, all that type of stuff. I've got a 4-year-old, and I'm trying to keep screens away from him, which is almost impossible. But I'm doing everything I can. He's having swimming lessons and tennis and all sorts of things, and we're doing tons of work on his reading and books to keep him away from it. And I think we're almost going to end up with a completely different digital divide, where we could end up with parents who don't know better actually having computers training their kids, being the school, and richer parents would be sending their kids to schools where it's all face-to-face, one-on-one type time or small group, and a completely reverse of the digital divide. And I think we kind of get this Silicon Valley. I know a lot of CEOs there are like, no, my kids don't, which is really interesting, kind of quite telling.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, what is it? The Greeks would always talk about balance, right? It's all about the balance for so many things. I think when you over-index on anything, it's going to be problematic. I on the one hand, my mother doesn't take any medicine whatsoever at 88. Like she can't, like her body can't tolerate it. She was the original granola cruncher, I think, before they existed. But then on the other hand, she had hip replacement surgery and she had to have anesthesia, right? So it's like, what is going to be appropriate at the time that it's needed? I've seen many parents use technology as like a pacifier for their child, just, because they don't have the time, it's a distraction, and they capitulate to the demands of a screaming, 6-year-old.
Sure.
So, the question is really just I look at it more in terms of institutional policies or states, right? What is their obligation to either support or regulate the implementation, the integration of these systems? And if we're not looking at them critically and looking at it critically from a human-centric position, right? So what is going to be the best in terms of the development for my child? 100%, screen time all the time, we know that's not healthy, right? But a complete abstinence of technology where they don't understand how to use it in a technology-driven landscape is also going to be a disadvantage as well. So I don't know that, this is the problem with philosophy and ethics. Even in IEEE, they're like, let's establish definitions for all these things. I'm like, you can't, right? This is right. In fact, I was just evaluating a paper for a conference. I'll remain nameless. And they said, we need to operationalize these ethical values. I'm like, you fundamentally don't understand ethics then. Like that's not actually how it works. The ethics and philosophy and values is contextual. It is a dialogic experience. It depends, right, on so much. And this is where I think the rigor is less on the definition, and it's where the implementation, the framework, like how do we understand these problems and how are we answering the problem, And I think most people want just a yes or no. They want a binary. Am I right? Am I wrong? And the problem with ethics and philosophy and even psychology is like, it depends. And it requires more mental, energy in that it depends space than just say, just tell me what to do.
Mm. I suppose one of the things that that's missing within the civic space, though, is monitoring of all of these things, because this interdisciplinary complex, we want human flourishing to be the outcome of this, right? We want technologies to be used to the purpose of human flourishing, to increase human well-being. So I think, you would be seeing, given the rate of development of these technologies in the education space, you would think the universities might have a board that had some neuroscientists on there, some sociologists, and one of the things that they're looking at is, are these tools making us more stupid? How do they affect like loneliness amongst our students?
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. You can go on, right? And then, are they making us more effective learners? Are they good for compensating for social mobility? Because now poorer kids maybe can have some adaptive learning modules and really help them to fast track in all the things that used to be the provenance of the middle class in languages and music, blah, blah, blah. But we just don't have that. And there's no sign that we would ever have that kind of monitoring. Like even at the level of the discussion, I would say, in a kind of a university board, the discussion is not about human flourishing. The discussion is really led by the technology. What does the technology do, and how can we incorporate it? So how do we get these conversations to cover all the bases that we need them to?
Yeah. So a couple months ago, I was invited to a panel. It was a mini conference in DC. There's a university in Maryland that was looking to institute a learning engineering master's degree, right? Learning engineering is starting to really kind of emerge. It's not instructional design and it's not classroom teaching. It's really, again, this idea of designing technology systems for data. And the dean said, okay, you've seen our program. This is what we're proposing. These are the courses that we think the students should take. What are we missing? And of course, I raised my hand because that's what I do. And I said, for all that is holy, I said that, for all that is holy, make them take a philosophy class, because if you cannot teach them to think, none of the rest of it matters. So I think part of the problem, it was interesting when I was studying civics education in the United States, and like by the 80s, it was no longer really a requirement to understand what democracy actually was. It was just like, okay, forms of government, here we go. The problem for our judicial system is it is based in philosophy. It is all deductive, inductive reasoning. It is all that trying to, think deeply about a problem and not just matching surface features. This is where the interdisciplinary requirement has to happen in schools. Because if our technologists and our engineers and our teachers, our policymakers, our business folks, I deeply believe this, if we are not compelling them to engage in these bigger, broader philosophical discussions, no one's going to bring it to the table. And then this was the problem when I mentioned the TLA chapter, when we said, hey, here are all the questions you should be asking yourselves, is because what I've recognized is that you can say, oh, human flourishing, that's great. What does that mean? And to me, it's not necessary. It's not even enough to say this is what it means as a definition. It's like, these are the questions we need to ask in order to investigate whether we're actually achieving something like human flourishing, transparency, sustainability. So I think when we educate, and this is what I appreciate about IEEE so much, because it's a completely volunteer organization. It is global. We have to reach consensus. But part of the objective for the standards is not just to tell the community of engineers and electricians, here's a standard. It's also supposed to educate the consumer, right? It's supposed to educate the consumer to say, before you buy this product, have you considered these things, right? So it's outwardly facing. And I think in a similar way, institutes of higher learning, at a minimum, should be populating policies and decision-making. Put a freaking philosopher in there. put somebody in there, because what I've learned about philosophy, thanks to my daughter, and my father, who's also a philosopher, what I've learned is a lot of time, it's not just how we define something, it's also how we are thinking about the problem, how we're scoping the answer, and how we are connecting the dots between the premise and the solution, right? Or the proposed solution. Mm-hmm. And trying to, and especially in this LLM AI, generative AI space, when what's fascinating is that we're really close, because I think people are starting to understand how you develop your prompt influences the output. Well, developing a prompt is not that far away from being able to devise a good question, because what I teach my students is if you ask a bad question, you're going to get bad data. Mm-hmm. So we have to teach them what are the important questions that they should be asking. The important question is not what does the technology do? That's kind of important. Like, we want to understand the system. But the more important question is, to what end are we using this? What is the end result for this? And then what's the harm, either by implementing it or not implementing it? Yeah. That's philosophical. That's not technological, and that's not an engineering approach. So teach philosophy. Get them jobs. I think we need them.
I mean, I'm very happy with philosophy to be to become a core aspect of all education. I suppose my concern would be that I can imagine. Let's just go forward just a couple of years, maybe just to the end of this decade, to 2030. Let's go there. I can imagine that we're going to have a lot more data then about what's actually happening within the educational space. How are these tools being used? What is the response of educational establishments to incorporating them? How are students learning, etc., etc. So for me, it's like it will be a stress test for education. If the data says, well, look, it's really great at facilitating these things, but people are becoming a bit dumber, and loneliness is off the scale. My worry is, even if that were the case, the signs that we would then correct for that at both a social, philosophical, and institutional level are not good. I don't think that we would correct for that. I think that technology has a weird kind of momentum, especially in Western society. Maybe it's more global than I appreciate. But once it kind of gets going, and we have track record on this, don't we, with the smartphones? You know, we rolled the smartphone out, and then like 20 years later, we went, oh, hang on, everybody, this is causing mayhem. You know, everyone's got anxiety and depression and blah, blah, blah. Smartphone plus kind of internet. So I think one of the things that certainly I'm interested in, is having those conversations like you're suggesting we do have. It's just, where are those receptive voices to? This is an opportunity now, while this stuff is being developed, while it's being incorporated, to say, let's just keep monitoring what the impact of it is, and have discussions about what the overall value set is and what do we want that to look like.
I really believe deeply in the volunteer organizations, right? Like an organization like IEEE. There are other bodies out there that are interested in ethics and regulations and evaluating these things. I also think it's important that we educate the population, right? One of the concerns I have with, we're going to implement these technology solutions in the classroom, and then we're going to look at the data and say, oh, it leads to, loneliness, depression, what have you. My question is always, but what was the system? What was it for? What were they using it for? What was the engagement, right? There are platforms, again, like the example I said before, I could engage in an AI wrapper to have a conversation and says, you did a great job, but maybe it's lying to me, right? Like, so that data that says, when I was with I was director of innovation and experimentation for a short time with the Defense Acquisition University, part of the Department of Defense. And, I was looking at their training for their acquisition managers, and they were telling me about the metrics that they had for their e-learning courses, right? The stuff that they're deployed online. And the metrics was, well, this course, many more people complete this course. We've got great metrics on this one. This one, people don't finish. I said, that does not tell you it's a good course. That just tells you someone can complete it, right? It may be that the harder course is a better course. I'm like, that's not great data, right? So we have to look at the system to say, just because they're engaged with it doesn't mean it's designed well and it's designed to promote. I mean, to play a little bit of devil's advocate, and I will say my bias is I'm an introvert. My father would always say, love humanity, hate people kind of thing. Right? Love humanity, people sometimes make me crazy. And I look at these systems and say, yes, maybe there's an over-reliance on having AI companions, you know, and how is that going to affect our relationships with other people? I'm like, maybe it'll be better, right? Right now, most people suck. Like most people, they're, you know, mean, they're cruel, they're prejudicial, they can be vindictive, they can be abusive. Like even just learning, like this is, I look at students who have not had good role models. Like what is a healthy relationship? Did they even have that as a role model growing up? And so how can we use these systems to say, like, this is not an appropriate thing to say, or this is hurtful, or have you considered, you know, the perspective of another person? So we can design it in what I would like to see systems where it actually helps support better interactions with humans. Because right now, you know, let's not kid ourselves. War in Iran, people are blowing people up, you know, child pornography, child rings, like people can be horrible. And I wonder, like, how did that happen? And, you know, some of it is just simple reward. You know, you get a lot of money for doing bad things. But I also think at some point, people rise up and they protest, right? So that's only going to sustain for a certain amount of time bad behavior. I look at these systems to say, like, we have an opportunity to, if we use them well, to say, how are we supporting better interactions with other people? Because I don't know that we've got that mastered. Like my undergrad was history. I'll never forget when I was studying American history, which I was not a fan of, but I did like this course. And I was reading a book on Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, studying the Civil War. And it was like the first Battle of Manassas. So I'm reading this, you know, so they were comparing the two leadership styles of these two generals. And within the Battle of Manassas is considered one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. And so what I was reading, it was like within the first 15 minutes, they mowed down 2,000 soldiers. Within the first 15 minutes of that one battle, and I think there was at least two. I think there was two in Manassas, but I know definitely one. And I was like, that's if you took my entire high school on Long Island and put them on the football field and you just shot everybody down. In the scope, and for us, when we study American history, what we knew is that the amount of men that were killed during the 4 years of our Civil War equaled the American Revolution, the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, the Korean War. I mean, it was just the amount of, it was like 600, 800,000 people were killed, right? And in close combat quarters. This is not like over a period of time. The devastation from that war, I said, forget history, I don't want to study it anymore. And so I decided to do that because it was depressing. I'm like, what do I do with the fact that all of this slaughter happened? There's nothing I can do to change that. That's really why I pivoted, because I said, well, how do we make that not happen again? And it's not, we need to study history, obviously, but I'm also interested, but how do we change that course? What are the things that we need to do to create better humans? Because, you know, when you study at least the Western Civ stuff, we've acted horribly with each other. And I don't see it stopping anytime real soon. So I could either be depressed and just never leave my house, right? Or say, I've got to believe that there's a better way that we can do this, right? And maybe we could do it through technology. That's a hypothesis.
It leads me on nicely, probably what's going to be our last question. So what does 2049 look like? If you imagine what it, if you imagine 2049, what's happening? How's the world changed? How's that affecting education and learning?
Well, 2049, you know, I do think about, like, so we take through the analysis of AI systems, we look at automation driving potentially automation in our homes, right? Look at automations of jobs. You know, I think the apocalyptic part of myself says things are bad, right? Things are bad. People don't have jobs. Everybody's starving. We're in a really deep, dark place. It's like the Dark Ages all over again. Potentially, right? Or we have enough foresight to say, what are the things we need to do as a society to sustain human development, right? Like on the one hand, I do think a lot about the ancient Greeks just because they're so interesting. I've always found it fascinating. Yes, they had slavery, Right. So they had slavery, but the ruling population was able to kind of lounge around, eat grapes, and philosophize. Like that's kind of what they were, think about literature, go to the theater, that kind of thing. And I thought, well, if we had, I'm probably, this is going to come back and bite me, but if we think about the AI automated system as a serving class, as opposed to a ruling class, right? Like, so we have enough control and monitor what they're doing. How does that then enable humanity to be more self-actualized, to be able to engage in creative thinking and reasoning? Right now, I mean, on a positive note, we think work and occupations is a way of people, how they identify, right? I identify with my job. I identify with what I do. And that could be problematic when you lose your job. Then it changes then to like, well, who am I now? Right? As opposed to saying, who am I now should be the first thing we're operating from. And then what I do is kind of secondary. If we're able to offload what I do so that we can continue to be who I want to be, I think that could be a very promising future.